There is a person in your life who is extremely good at something. Maybe it is your doctor who uses words you have never heard before and then looks surprised when you ask what they mean. Maybe it is your colleague who cannot explain their own work without losing you in the first 30 seconds. Maybe it is a teacher who genuinely cannot understand why their students are confused because the material seems so obvious to them. These people are not being arrogant. They are not trying to confuse you. They are experiencing something that psychologists have spent decades studying, a cognitive trap so powerful that it affects everyone from Nobel Prize winners to kindergarten teachers. It is called the curse of knowledge. And once you understand it, you will see it everywhere. The curse of knowledge was formally identified in 1990 by economists Colin Cameron, George Loewenstein, and Martin Weber. They published a paper describing a fundamental problem in human communication. Once you know something, it becomes nearly impossible to imagine not knowing it. Your brain permanently rewires itself around new information. The moment knowledge enters your mind, it changes how you see everything connected to it. And that change is irreversible. You cannot unknow something. You cannot go back to the mental state you were in before you learned it. And this creates a gap, sometimes a vast and unbridgeable gap, between the person who knows and the person who does not. The person who knows cannot fully see across that gap anymore. They have forgotten what it felt like to stand on the other side. The most famous demonstration of this effect came from a Stanford University experiment conducted by Elizabeth Newton in 1990. She divided participants into two groups, tappers and listeners. The tappers were given a list of well-known songs, things like Happy Birthday or the national anthem, and asked to tap the rhythm of those songs on a table using their finger. The listeners had to guess what song was being tapped. Before the experiment began, Newton asked the tappers to predict what percentage of listeners would correctly identify the song. The tappers predicted that listeners would guess correctly about 50% of the time. The actual result was that listeners guessed correctly less than 3% of the time. But here's the fascinating part. While the tappers were tapping, they reported feeling frustrated and confused by the listeners. They could not understand why the listeners were struggling, because in the tappers' minds they could hear the song perfectly. Every tap was accompanied by the full melody playing in their head. They had forgotten that the listeners could not hear that melody. They had forgotten what it was like to hear only the tapping without the song. That experiment captures the curse of knowledge in its purest form. The tapper knows the song, and because they know it, they cannot imagine experiencing only the taps. The knowledge is invisible to them. It has become so deeply integrated into their perception that they no longer notice it is there. This is exactly what happens when an expert tries to communicate with a beginner. The expert has spent years, sometimes decades, building an elaborate internal structure of knowledge. Concepts connect to other concepts. Terms carry rich layers of meaning. Patterns that took years to learn to see are now immediately obvious. And when the expert tries to explain something to someone who lacks that structure, they unconsciously assume the other person shares it. They skip steps. They use jargon. They explain things at a level that makes perfect sense given everything they know, but makes no sense at all to someone who does not share that foundation. This is why some of the smartest people in the world are also some of the worst teachers. Intelligence and knowledge are not the same thing as the ability to communicate. In fact, they can actively work against it. The more you know about a subject, the harder it becomes to remember what it was like not to know it. The harder it becomes to identify which steps you are skipping. The harder it becomes to see your explanation from the other person's perspective. A beginner explaining something to another beginner will often be clearer than an expert explaining the same thing, because the beginner still remembers the confusion. They still know which parts are hard. They have not yet forgotten what it felt like to not understand. The curse of knowledge shows up everywhere once you know to look for it. It shows up in medicine, where doctors speak to patients using clinical terminology that means nothing to someone without medical training, and then are genuinely surprised when patients make poor decisions based on misunderstanding. Studies have found that patients often leave medical appointments understanding far less than their doctors assume. It shows up in education, where textbooks are frequently written by leading experts in a field who have so thoroughly internalized the subject that they can no longer accurately predict which parts will confuse a new learner. It shows up in technology, where engineers design products that make intuitive sense to someone who understands how they work, but are baffling to ordinary users. It shows up in management, where experienced leaders forget what it was like to be new and cannot understand why their instructions are not being followed correctly. It shows up in parenting, where adults forget how much of what they know had to be explicitly taught to them and expect children to understand things that are not actually obvious at all. It shows up in everyday conversation constantly. Think about the last time someone explained something to you and you nodded along, pretending to understand because asking for clarification felt embarrassing. Now think about the last time you explained something to someone and assumed they understood because it seemed obvious. Both of those moments are the curse of knowledge operating. The explainer has forgotten how much knowledge they are assuming. The listener has been made to feel that their confusion is a personal failing rather than a predictable outcome of an explanation that skipped too many steps. The research goes even deeper. In one study, participants were asked to evaluate written instructions. When they read the instructions themselves, they rated them as clear and easy to follow. But when they watched someone else try to follow the same instructions and struggle, they were often unable to understand why the other person was confused. The instructions seemed obvious. The steps seemed clear. But what seemed clear to the person who already knew what the instructions were trying to achieve was genuinely unclear to someone approaching them fresh. This is the trap. Once you understand the destination, the map looks obvious. Before you understand the destination, the same map looks like meaningless lines. There is a reason why the best science communicators, the people who make complex ideas accessible to general audiences, are often not the leading researchers in their fields. The leading researchers are frequently too deep inside their knowledge to see it from the outside anymore. The best communicators have found a way to maintain both perspectives simultaneously. They understand the subject deeply, but they have also preserved or reconstructed their memory of not understanding it. They know which parts feel hard before you understand them. They know which analogies work and which ones only seem to work to someone who already knows the answer. That combination is genuinely rare. And it is why truly great teachers are so valuable. They are not just knowledgeable, they are knowledgeable, and they can remember what it felt like to not be. The solution to the curse of knowledge, to the extent that there is one, requires deliberate effort. It requires constantly questioning your own assumptions about what the other person knows. It requires testing your explanations, not by asking whether they make sense to you, but by watching whether they produce understanding in someone else. It requires slowing down at the exact moments that feel unnecessary to slow down, because those are often the moments where you are skipping something you forgot you knew. It requires using concrete examples instead of abstract descriptions, because examples work from the outside in, while abstractions work from the inside out. And it requires genuine humility about the gap between knowing something and being able to communicate it. The curse of knowledge is not a flaw unique to certain people. It is a feature of how human memory and learning work. Every time you learn something new, your brain integrates it into your existing understanding and begins treating it as obvious background knowledge. That process is essential. It is what allows expertise to develop. It is what allows complex skills to become automatic. But it comes at a cost, and the cost is the ability to remember what you did not know before. The tappers could not hear the silence. The experts could not see the gaps. And the rest of us are left trying to understand explanations that assume knowledge we do not yet have, wondering why things that seem obvious to everyone else remain unclear to us. They are not actually obvious. They were just learned so long ago that the person explaining them has forgotten they were ever difficult. That is the curse. And now that you know it exists, you will never stop seeing it.